I want to tell you about a vote that just took place. It was not an election. There were no campaigns, no speeches, no ballots that you would recognize, but it was a vote in the truest sense of the word, cast by the most powerful financial institutions on the planet, and the results should matter to every single person who holds savings in dollars, in pounds, or in any currency at all. Here is what happened. Every year, a survey is conducted of the world's central banks, the institutions that manage the national savings of entire countries, the people who decide where trillions of dollars of a nation's reserves are actually kept. These are not speculators. They are not gold salesmen. They are the most cautious, most conservative, most powerful money managers in existence, and their entire job is to protect the wealth of nations across decades. And in this year's survey, they were asked a simple question about the future. Over the next 5 years, do you expect your country to hold more United States dollars in its reserves or fewer? And 74% of them, nearly 3 out of every 4, said fewer dollars. Then they were asked about gold, the ancient metal, the asset with no yield, no dividend, no government behind it, the thing that modern financial experts have spent decades dismissing as a relic. Do you expect gold to make up a larger share of the world's reserves over the next 5 years? And 84% of them said yes. More gold, fewer dollars. That is the vote. Nearly 3/4 of the world's central banks planning to hold fewer dollars, and more than 4/5 expecting gold to rise, all at once, on the record, in the same survey. And it is already showing up in the actual numbers, not just the expectations, because as of this month, the dollar's share of global reserve portfolios has fallen to around 40%, while gold's share has climbed to around 28%. For most of your life, the dollar's share was far higher, and gold was an afterthought. That gap has been closing for years, and now it is closing faster. So the question I want to answer for you today is the one that actually matters. Why are the most conservative money managers on earth quietly backing away from the dollar, the currency that has ruled the world for 80 years? What do they know, or fear, that has made nearly 3/4 of them decide to hold less of it? And what does it mean for you, whose savings, whose pension, whose entire financial life is denominated in exactly the currency they are stepping away from? Over the next 20 minutes, I am going to answer all of that, carefully and without hysteria, and I am going to take you back to a single week in the autumn of 1956, because that week, a different global currency that everyone believed was eternal received a shock it never recovered from, and almost nobody saw it coming, and the story of how it happened is the clearest possible warning for the moment we are living in now. Stay with me. A vote has been cast, and you were not in the room, but the result lands on your doorstep all the same. Let me start by explaining what a reserve currency actually is, because this is the foundation of everything, and most people have never had it explained plainly, even though it shapes their entire financial existence. Imagine you are a country. You sell things to the world and you buy things from the world. And to do that, you need to hold a stockpile of some currency that everyone everywhere will always accept. You cannot hold every currency of every trading partner. That would be chaos. You need one or a few that are universally trusted, universally accepted, the financial equivalent of a language that everyone speaks. For the past 80 years, that language has overwhelmingly been the United States dollar. When Saudi Arabia sells oil, it is priced in dollars. When a company in Brazil trades with a company in Japan, very often the deal is settled in dollars. And so every country on earth keeps a great pile of dollars on hand, held in the form of American government debt, because that was the safest and most useful thing to hold. This is what it means for the dollar to be the world's reserve currency. It is not just America's money, it is the world's money, the default setting of the entire global financial system. And this status has given America an almost magical advantage, one that economists have a special name for, the exorbitant privilege. Because the whole world needs dollars and holds dollars, America can print its own currency to pay its debts, borrow more cheaply than any other nation, and run deficits that would sink any other country, all because there is a permanent, built-in, worldwide demand for its money. The reserve currency status is the invisible foundation beneath American prosperity, beneath low American interest rates, beneath the entire arrangement of the modern world. And it is that foundation that the world's central banks are now, quietly, in a survey, beginning to step back from. So the real question becomes, why? Why would they walk away from an arrangement that has been stable for 80 years? And the answer comes down to two forces, one of them about fear and one of them about arithmetic. Let me give you the fear first, because it is the more dramatic of the two, and it happened on a specific weekend that I have described in other briefings, because it is the hinge on which this entire era turns. In February of the year 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies did something that had rarely been done to a major power. They froze roughly $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves. Overnight, with the stroke of a pen, a vast portion of the savings that Russia had stored in the Western financial system became unusable. Now, whatever you believe about the politics of that decision, and there are serious arguments on every side, I need you to understand how it was received in the central banks of the world, because that reception is what is driving the vote I just described. Every central banker on earth watched that happen and absorbed a single permanent lesson. The dollars and the American bonds that a country holds are not unconditionally that country's property. They are that country's property only as long as that country remains in America's good graces. The moment a nation finds itself on the wrong side of Washington, its reserves, the savings it spent decades accumulating, can be switched off. For any country that can imagine ever even theoretically being in conflict with the United States, and that is a great many countries, this transformed the dollar from a safe haven into a potential trap. Holding your national wealth in dollars suddenly carried a risk it had never carried before, the risk that it could be frozen precisely when you needed it most. And so those countries began, carefully and without announcement, to reduce their dependence on the dollar and to move a portion of their wealth into the one asset that cannot be frozen by any foreign government, the one asset that sits in your own vault, on your own soil, under your own control, answerable to no one. Gold. That is the fear. It is not a fear that the dollar will lose its value tomorrow. It is a deeper, more structural fear, that dollars held in the open are a form of trust, and that the trust was broken, in full view of the world, on a single weekend in 2022. Now let me give you the arithmetic, because the fear alone would not be enough without it, and the arithmetic is, in its own quiet way, even more powerful than the fear. The United States now carries a national debt approaching $40 trillion. The interest on that debt alone now exceeds $1 trillion every single year, an amount larger than the entire American military budget, growing larger every month. And here is what a central banker sees when they look at that. They see a borrower whose debts are growing faster than its economy, whose interest payments are ballooning, and who has, historically, only ever had a limited number of ways out of a debt burden that large. A country can pay its debts down through painful austerity, which is politically almost impossible at this scale. It can default, which America will never formally do because it controls its own currency, or, and this is the one that matters, it can allow inflation to run persistently a little hotter than the interest it pays, so that the real value of the debt quietly shrinks over time, melting away like ice, paid down not through honest repayment, but through the slow erosion of the currency's value. That last path is the one that history says heavily indebted nations almost always take in the end, because it is the least painful politically and the most invisible to the public. But here is the thing. If you are a central banker holding a nation's wealth, and you can see that the most likely path for the world's reserve currency is a slow, deliberate erosion of its value to manage an unpayable debt, then holding that currency is a slow, guaranteed loss. And so, again, the rational move is to reduce your dollars and increase your holding of the one asset whose supply cannot be inflated away by any government, the asset that has held its value through every currency debasement in 5,000 years of human history. Gold. Do you see how the fear and the arithmetic point in exactly the same direction? The fear says dollars can be frozen. The arithmetic says dollars will likely be eroded. And the world's central banks, looking at both, have quietly concluded that the prudent thing, the conservative thing, the responsible thing for the wealth of their nations is to hold fewer dollars and more gold. That is why 74% of them voted the way they did. It was not radicalism, it was caution. Now I have to stop, as I always do, and be scrupulously honest with you, because there is a wild and frightening version of this story that I refuse to tell, and you deserve the balanced truth right alongside the dramatic one. So let me be very clear about the limits of what I am saying. The dollar is not about to collapse. It is not about to lose its status as the world's primary currency. Not this year, not this decade, and quite possibly not in the lifetime of anyone watching this. The shift I am describing is a slow one, measured in the movement from, say, 70% of reserves down toward 40% over the course of many years, and further declines will likely take many years more. The dollar remains, by an enormous margin, the most used, most trusted, most dominant currency on earth, and there is no rival ready to replace it. The euro is the currency of a fractured continent with no unified treasury. The Chinese yuan cannot be a true reserve currency precisely because China controls it so tightly, which is the opposite of the openness a reserve currency requires. There is quite simply no throne-ready successor. So what is happening is not a coronation of a new king, it is an erosion of the old one, a slow diversification, a gradual reduction of dependence, not a sudden collapse. And anyone who takes this story and tells you the dollar will be worthless by next year, especially if they are using that claim to sell you gold coins at a fat premium or a survival newsletter, is not informing you, they are hunting you, and you should keep your hand firmly on your wallet, because that panic is precisely the emotion they are trying to manufacture and profit from. What I am telling you is far calmer and far more useful than any prophecy of doom. I am telling you that a real, measurable, verifiable shift is underway, that the most conservative money managers on earth are on the record backing away from the dollar and toward gold, that the reasons they are doing so are sound and structural rather than hysterical, and that this slow shift will quietly shape the value of your savings over the years and decades to come. Understanding that calmly is worth infinitely more than either ignoring it or panicking about it. And the best way to understand where a slow erosion like this leads is to look at the last time a mighty global reserve currency was quietly dethroned. Which brings me to the week I promised you, the autumn of 1956. To understand it, you have to remember that for well over a century, the world's dominant reserve currency was not the American dollar, it was the British pound sterling. The British Empire spanned the globe, and the pound was the currency of world trade, the money in which nations kept their savings, the undisputed king. Even after the Second World War, even as American power was clearly rising, the pound clung to its status, and Britain clung to the belief that it was still a first-rank global power whose currency commanded the world's respect. And then came a crisis over the Suez Canal, that vital waterway in Egypt, through which so much of the world's trade and oil flowed. When Egypt moved to nationalize the canal, Britain, together with France and Israel, launched a military operation to seize it back. It was, in the old imperial style, an assertion of power, a statement that Britain still ran the world. But something happened that Britain did not expect, and it did not come from Egypt. It came from Britain's own closest ally, the United States. The American government disapproved of the operation, and it possessed a weapon far more powerful than any army. America held a large quantity of British pounds, and it signaled that it was prepared to sell them, which would crash the value of the pound, and simultaneously it blocked Britain's access to emergency financial support. In other words, America threatened Britain's currency and its reserves. And Britain, facing the collapse of the pound, had no choice. It backed down, humiliated, and withdrew. Now here is why that week matters so much, and why almost nobody understood its true significance at the time. On the surface, Suez was a military and political crisis. But underneath, it was a monetary event, the moment it became undeniable to the entire world that the pound was no longer the currency of an independent great power, that it now existed at the mercy of the United States, that its status as a trusted reserve currency was finished. And the world's central banks, watching this, did exactly what central banks are doing today. They quietly began moving their reserves out of pounds and into dollars, accelerating a shift that had been creeping along for years. There was no single dramatic day when the pound fell and the dollar rose. There was a slow erosion and then a crisis that revealed what the erosion had already accomplished, and after that the decline was undeniable and irreversible. The pound, once the king of currencies, faded into an ordinary national currency, and a generation of Britons who had assumed their money would rule the world forever discovered, slowly and then painfully, that it would not. So let me draw the line from that autumn week in 1956 to the survey published this year, because it is the same line, and it should command your full attention. Then, as now, a global reserve currency that everyone assumed was eternal was quietly eroding beneath the surface. Then, as now, the erosion was driven by a combination of financial overstretch and a loss of the absolute trust on which reserve status depends. Then, as now, the world's central banks were quietly, without announcement, beginning to shift their reserves away from the fading currency and toward the rising alternative. And then, the shift took years to complete, and there was no single dramatic day, only a slow movement that a crisis eventually revealed. I am not telling you that the dollar is about to have its Suez moment tomorrow. It may be many years away, and it may unfold so gradually that no single week ever marks the turning. But I am telling you that the pattern of a reserve currency's decline is remarkably consistent across history. It begins with overstretch and debt. It accelerates when trust is damaged. It shows up first as a quiet diversification by the most sophisticated money managers, the central banks, long before the general public notices anything at all. And it is measured in its early stages in exactly the kind of survey I described at the start, in which 74% of central banks say they plan to hold fewer dollars, and 84% expect gold to rise. That survey is not noise. It is the early, quiet, sophisticated stage of exactly the pattern that dethroned the pound, and the Dutch guilder before it, and the Spanish real before that. Every reserve currency in history was once believed to be eternal. Every single one was eventually dethroned. And the people who saw it early, who noticed the quiet diversification of the smart money before the crisis made it obvious, were the ones who protected themselves. The people who assumed permanence were the ones caught off guard. So let me bring this home to your kitchen table, the way I always do, because this is not really about central banks or the pound or the Suez Canal. It is about you, and about one calm adjustment in how you understand the money in your own life. The single most valuable thing I can give you today is this. Do not assume that the financial arrangement you were born into is a permanent feature of the universe. It is not. It is a temporary condition, currently in the early stages of a slow change, and the most sophisticated money managers on earth are telling you so, on the record, in a survey, right now. That does not mean you should panic, sell everything, or make any sudden move, because the shift is slow, and a sudden move is exactly the mistake that this understanding should help you avoid. What it means is simply that you should be aware, and that awareness leads to one calm, free, no-pressure question you can ask yourself. If the world's central banks are quietly diversifying away from an over-reliance on a single currency, is my own wealth over-reliant on that same single currency, without my ever having consciously chosen it? For most people, the honest answer is that nearly everything they own, their savings, their pension, their income, the value of their home, is denominated in one currency, tied to the fate of one currency, exposed entirely to the fate of one currency, and they never once made that as a deliberate choice. It simply happened to them, the way the concentration in an index fund simply happens to people who never chose it. You do not need to do anything about that today. You do not need to buy gold, and I am certainly not telling you to. You simply need to know the answer, to be conscious of the exposure you carry, because a person who knows the shape of their own risk can make calm, deliberate decisions over years, while a person who has never looked is the one who is caught off guard when the slow change finally becomes a visible one. And if T-hat awareness ever leads you toward a real change in how your wealth is arranged, make it the way I counsel at the end of every single briefing, slowly, over weeks of unhurried thought, with the guidance of a professional who is legally bound to act in your interest, and never in response to a countdown, a deadline, or a frightening voice insisting you must act today, because that urgency is the single most reliable sign of someone who is trying to take what you have spent a lifetime building. So let me close the loop. I opened, a vote was cast this year, quietly, in a survey, by the most conservative and powerful money managers on earth, the central banks that guard the wealth of nations. 74% of them said they plan to hold fewer United States dollars over the next 5 years. 84% said they expect gold to hold a larger share of the world's reserves, and it is already visible in the real numbers, with the dollar's share of global reserves fallen to around 40% and gold's risen to around 28%, a gap that has been closing for years and is closing faster now. The reasons are not hysterical, they are sound. A fear born on the weekend in 2022 when the world learned that dollar reserves can be frozen, and an arithmetic that says a nation with a $40 trillion debt will most likely in the end erode the value of its own currency to manage it. Neither of those is a prediction of imminent collapse, and I have been careful to tell you that the dollar remains dominant and will for a long time yet. But both of them are reasons why the smartest, most cautious money on earth is quietly diversifying, exactly as the smart money quietly diversified away from the British pound in the years around 1956, long before the general public understood that the age of sterling was ending. Every reserve currency in history was once thought eternal, and everyone was eventually dethroned, always slowly, always quietly at first, always visible in the behavior of the central banks, long before it was visible to anyone else. I cannot tell you the timing, and I would never insult you by pretending to. But I can tell you that the vote has been cast, that it is verifiable in the central bank's own words, and that almost no one in your life has any idea it happened, because it made no headlines and arrived in the dry pages of a survey rather than the noise of a crisis. If this briefing showed you a quiet vote that will shape the value of your money for years to come, take a moment to share it with one person you care about, whose entire financial life rests, without their ever having chosen it, on the fate of a single currency. And I would truly love to hear from those of you who carry history in your memory. If you remember the days when Britain still believed the pound ruled the world, or if your family ever spoke of a time when the money of a great power quietly lost its throne, tell that story in the comments, because there is someone young reading this who believes the dollar's reign is a permanent law of nature, and the memory of those who have seen otherwise is the only teacher that can reach them before the lesson arrives on its own. I read every single comment. I will see you, as always, in the next briefing.